Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 135th edition of the Frank and Stan chat. And I'm delighted to say that we have another guest with us today. It's Peter Wright. Hello, Peter.
Hello. Hi, Frank.
Yeah. Do you want to just say what you do, Peter? Not in detail, because we'll come back to that in a minute, but what sort of role have you got at the moment?
Yeah, sure. No problem. I've got a few hats on. So I teach ancient history and classical civilization at Blackpool Sixth Form College. I also coordinate our High Achievers program, which gives students a platform for making applications to competitive universities and apprenticeships. And I also coordinate the teaching of Latin and Greek in several Blackpool primary and secondary schools.
Wow. Well, and I think that's something we're going to dig into a little bit later. So anyway, how are you, Stan?
I'm okay. I do this every so often, Frank, where I turn it around and say, well, how about you? Because you ask me every week how I am. I never seem to ask you back.
Right. Well, it's not a great week, I have to say. My daughter, Philippa, is expecting her second child. She has a number of underlying health conditions, and she, I think, is just coming out of hospital today, having been there for 4 days. She's 31 weeks pregnant, and they're going to try and keep the baby going until 34, 35, keep it as long as possible. But also, you will know Barry, my brother, former HMI in Wales. He is very ill at the moment, and he is in Swansea Hospital. So my thoughts are with both of them, and I'm sure Philippa will be fine. I hope Barry, gives it every shot to, because he's a great guy, and has been a fantastic brother, but also a great guest on here. Been fantastic. Yeah. In fact, I think, Stan, you said that if you'd met Barry before me, you would have probably preferred him than me.
Yeah, he'd have been a better mate than you, I think.
Okay, so so it's a bit of a funny time, but anyway, let's move on. So Peter, Latin, where did all that start?
Yeah.
Rome, I would have thought, Frank.
2,000 years. So obviously, I studied sort of classical history and Latin at university, and then so I've been teaching at the Blackpool Sixth Form since 2006, running the ancient history and the classical civilization courses.
Is it popular, that course?
Yeah, really popular, really popular. I think we've got one of the biggest groups in the country, but every year we have always between sort of 110, 130 students.
Really?
Which is brilliant. Yeah, it's fascinating. It's just, I think it's because it's just something a little bit new and a little bit different. And you're also using your previous sort of historical knowledge. But I think the real brilliance of looking at classical history in translation is that you can link it to any subject area that you're interested in. So amongst our, say, typical cohort of 120 students, we'll have students that are looking at medical entry, they're doing biology and chemistry and doing ancient history. We'll have artists that are doing ancient history. We'll have obviously the historians, and I'm pretty confident in saying that amongst our cohort, we'll have had every other subject at the college selected with ancient history as a combination. So it's one of those that whatever interests you bring to the table, you're always going to find something to hook you. But also, I think it just opens your eyes to the environment that you're in. Even typically, you're thinking of Blackpool. Well, there can't be too many Roman things around Blackpool. But then as soon as you start opening the eyes of the students to, obviously, local sites, but also the architecture of the town that they live in, and the links to the history and the politics that they're looking at, you get a fresh view of the area that you're living in. And I think that's why it's proven really popular over the years. So so we've been teaching that for a very long time. And then about 5 years ago, I was approached by a brilliant charity called Classics for All, to see whether I'd be interested in leading some type of Latin provision in the Blackpool area. And from that, we've sort of grown to 9 schools now in Blackpool that are offering some type of sort of Latin,
so that's secondaries
or
and
even
primaries.
Greek provision.
Secondary
and primary, yeah, brilliant, yeah. So it's been really fantastic just to see how popular the subject as a whole is, but also the relevance of it and the amount of buy-in from local leaders once they've seen that it's not just Life of Brian and people wearing togas, that there is a relevance to it. It's really been fantastic to see it grow.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think it's all I remember is my brother went to a grammar school and he learned. I think he studied Latin at York University, and for him it was all of this blue blah blue blah, whatever it was, and he used to come back reciting all of this, and it meant for me it was in his school, it was the thing you had to do. There was no option, so it was no going away. It wasn't, he had to overcome it. But one of the things that it was very much about the speaking and writing of Latin. I suspect they did do some of the sort of more interesting stuff perhaps about the history of it, but it was very much around as a language,
So Peter, if I am interested in ancient history, but interested at a level that I'll watch something if it comes on Discovery Channel or something like that.
Yeah, sure.
What book would you direct me to say, read this and this will get you into, let's say, ancient Greece and what was going on at the time?
Yeah, well, I mean, I had a really great discussion actually about that. It must have been about 2 years ago, and Radio 5 actually rang up. I think it was 3 years ago, and Danny Dyer had brought out a TV series on the Tudors. I think it was Henry VIII.
Oh yeah.
And Radio 5 had got myself and a couple of academics to participate. I think it was a drive time show. And they were asking us about the merits of Danny Dyer's Tudors sort of series. And I hadn't seen it. And there was one academic, and he was very much belittling it, saying, "Oh, well, you can't possibly do this because X, Y, and Z's not going to be right, and it's going to be inaccurate, etc., etc." I sort of threw a grenade in the argument from my point of view, because I think that sort of popular history and even historical fiction is actually really incredible. It's that little doorway into something that you might not have considered before. So we'll get students, for instance, and they've watched Gladiator, or they've watched 300, or they've watched Troy, and obviously, when you're looking at something like those big Hollywood films, historically speaking, they're all over the show, in terms of the actual accuracy of it. But if it gets someone interested and curious in that period, then I think there's a real value for it. I mean, don't ask me to talk about Gladiator. I'll go off on a rambling for about 3 hours about the inaccuracies of Gladiator. But if it gets someone interested in something, and it makes them even just do that little, I know we attack Google and Wikipedia as academics, but if it gets them to do that first little bit of that little bit of research, I think there's gonna be real value there. So I think if you're looking at ancient Greece, you've got some brilliant, obviously, modern historians, people like Bettany Hughes and Michael Scott, that do some fantastic documentaries for the mainstream viewer. But then equally, there's some brilliant historical fiction that's been produced. I love the Robert Harris trilogy where he was looking at Cicero. I mean, that's brilliant. I remember my dad saying, "Oh, have a read of this," and I thought, "Dad, come on. I studied Cicero for like 15, 20 years. There's nothing going to be new here." But it was brilliant. It was so well written. It was excellent. Really fantastic. So I think historical fiction, obviously modern day documentaries, but then obviously nothing, I think, can beat reading the actual source. So I think, if you're looking at ancient Greece, you're never going to go far wrong in reading a good translation of a Herodotus, who's just brilliant. He takes you on a travel guide of the ancient world, all the way from Persia to Egypt.
So how accessible is that? How accessible is that, Peter? How accessible is it? Is it relatively, for a
Yeah,
novice like me?
I, guess what- I- yeah, I think for a novice, something like a Herodotus or a Plutarch are really, really, really accessible. Plutarch is my absolute favorite classical writer because he writes these little bite-sized biographies of who he thinks are sort of the superstars of ancient history.
Right.
You get a copy of Plutarch's Fall of the Republic for about £3 on Amazon or something, and you've got these brilliant little biographies of all of these key Greek and Roman figures. Suetonius as well, really accessible, and that's the brilliant thing when you're introducing students to these writers. Especially as a teacher, if you're looking at the vocabulary and you're looking at the sort of the literacy challenges that students are likely to face when you're looking at that type of work, but with sort of careful scaffolding and with the introduction of sort of key terms and terminology and the language that they're encountering, a student can really enjoy reading Plutarch or Suetonius just as much as you can Harry Potter. And incidentally, there's so much Latin in Harry Potter as well. So it's all
Oh, right. Well, okay. Well, that's fantastic. Really interesting. And that's a first for us, Stan, isn't it, to have
Yeah.
a chat about the teaching of Latin. Uh, right. Well, it's been a very interesting week. I mean, we've said all along since we started this that unfortunately it's the government that keeps on giving. And there've been a number of events that have happened over the last week or so, including the Prime Minister asking or telling the chairman of the Conservative Party to stand down, and so that has now happened. And so it's just, and there are a number of other things rumbling along, which may become part of this discussion. You never know. So, Stan, what's caught your eye this week?
Well, one that I think might be of interest, and it'll probably affirm thoughts in a number of schools, in that the Southampton University have done a review of, I think it's 35,000 inspections. And one of the conclusions is in primary schools that female lead inspectors are more harsh than male lead inspectors when it comes to overall judgments. And neither are as harsh as HMI. But it strikes me that I've actually just sent an email to say, have they taken into consideration the gender of the head teacher, and does that have an impact? Or is it just their view that these are harsher decisions based on a harsher judgment? But there'll be a lot of schools saying, aha, that's what went wrong with our inspection. We should have had a male, or we should have had a female. So it's just, I think what struck me was I expected it to say somewhere along the lines, but our research has so many flaws that we can't. But it actually says this is significant because I think it's something like just over 3%.
Yeah.
More harshly judged, and that of 35,000 is obviously quite a significant number.
Did it talk about the HMIs, the male female HMIs?
No, it didn't. It just grouped HMI. I think I've not read the full report. I've only read a summary. Yeah. But it said neither were as harsh. Well, when they say it's harsh, it's likely to put a school into inadequate than an Ofsted HMI was. Yeah. They call them Ofsted inspectors and HMIs. That's the differentiation. Yeah. But it's interesting, and I think, I don't know, my experience is it's the relationship that's the important part between the head and the lead inspector, and where that is positive. I'm not saying it affects the outcome, the final judgments, but it does affect the nuances. It affects how the inspection takes place in school, and I think to some extent that the language of the report is influenced by that report, that relationship, the rapport between the head and the lead inspector.
Yeah. I mean, I think I've done a lot, as you know, but of inspections. But actually, I think it's very interesting, and it's so much more challenging when you don't hit it off, and actually it takes you about 5 minutes to work out whether you're going to hit it off. You know, the first 5 minutes of those, not just on the phone, but just the face-to-face discussion, is pretty critical. So I think that I, for one, never went in thinking, "Oh, I want this to be awful," you know. But actually, it could quickly get into a downward tailspin from that very first conversation, you know.
Yeah.
And I think
I've always said to schools when we've done any training on inspections that first phone call is absolutely crucial. You were there, Frank, when I took a phone call, the first inspection we did together, where at 9 o'clock I rang the school and the secretary said, can I speak to the head? And they said, oh, he's not in yet. So, all right, what time's he likely to be in? Oh, any time in the next 5 or 10 minutes.
Wasn't there one also that said, oh, he never comes in on a Tuesday before 9:30 or something because he's got his DJ set the night before? Something like that. Some of them are less obvious, though, aren't they? About it's really also about the willingness of a senior leader to be open with the inspector. You know, so I actually give credit when head teachers say things like, well, I think you're going to find this. You know, it's not where it ought to be. You know, just putting it like that. Whereas the worst thing is when you have your chat, everything seems fine, and then within the next 10 minutes you find the stuff that they should have told you wasn't going very well. So I think it's all just that sort of I know it's got to be careful how much you reveal, but actually I do think a level of openness on the obvious things is really important.
Well, I told you that one of my inspections, the head said, I've written what I think the outcome should be on an envelope. It's in my desk, and at the end of the inspection, I'll share it with you.
Okay, Peter, what's caught your eye this week?
I picked out Alan Cumming returning his OBE, which I thought was really quite interesting, and in particular, his justification for returning his OBE and the reference that he made to the British Empire in it, which I thought was really interesting. He said about the conversations about the role of the monarchy after the death of the Queen, and especially the way the British Empire profited at the expense and death of indigenous peoples. So as a historian, that automatically made me quite, you know, got me interested, because there is that debate about the legacy of the British Empire that's still very current in education as to what we actually teach in history and what is on a national curriculum and what is on a GCSE, and the different sides of that debate of the British Empire and you know the impacts that it unquestionably had. And the reason why it got me really was not really to get into a complex debate about the British Empire and its legacy, but for me as a classicist and as someone who loves the languages, I thought it was really fascinating about the use of that word empire and the toxicity of that word. And it sort of got me thinking about how we viewed empire sort of historically, and you know, certainly you could make the argument that sort of pre-World War One, a lot of classicists would view the Roman Empire as a very positive, you know, brilliant thing. And then post World War One, World War Two, you've got this massive revisionist view of the Roman Empire. So on the one hand, it got me really interested, and I thought, you know, that there were connections there with how we as a country have interpreted empire based on our experiences and the context of which our histories are written. But then equally, these debates have already been had 2,500 years ago. So you know, my students, we've just been looking at a period of Greek history that's dominated by the Athenians, and Athens is always viewed as a goodie because of its role in stopping the Persians from invading Greece and as the world's first democracy. So it's always got that label as a goodie. But then when you actually study what the Athenians do, they turn an anti-Persian alliance, UN, into their own empire, and incredibly brutal to anybody that's wanting to leave there. And so my students, they were reading a historian, Thucydides, who's a contemporary to events, and he's discussing in the mouth of a Sicilian chap about how brutal the Athenians are, and how the legacy of their empire is enslaved fellow Greeks. And then similarly, there's other Roman writers that play around with that concept, even when the Roman Empire is at its height. So 500 years after the Greeks, you've got writers like Tacitus, who are very much saying 2,000 years ago the same type of rhetoric that we hear being discussed about the negativity of empire. There's a brilliant scene in when he's talking about Agricola, who is his father-in-law, but he's a guy who's conquered big chunks of Britain, in Scotland in particular. And just before this massive battle between the barbarian groups and the Roman forces, the leader of the barbarian group stands forward, and he says a very famous speech, and there's a brilliant line in it. And he says, "They make it a desert and call it peace." And again, yeah, it just sort of shows the cyclical nature, or Thucydides would say that as well, the cyclical nature of human events and human interpretation of events. And again, this issue of empire, we think we're quite unique in having that debate and having that discussion. But in actual fact, if we just trawl through our history, we'll see that we're not the first people to have to deal with such a tricky legacy. And that got me really thinking about that.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's today the Australians have announced that they're not going to have the King Charles's head on the notes anymore.
Yes,
So and that's been said that's a positive decolonization. I don't understand the terms, if I'm honest, but they were going to reflect indigenous population rather than the monarch. So it's a day for talking empire and Commonwealth.
It's a shame that the award, like I think in France, isn't it the government, or in effect the country, award individuals, and not just French individuals, but world leaders and whatever, with an honor, and it's a shame in a way that the country can't do that. It's still got this. It does seem a bit old hat, doesn't it? The OBE, MBE type thing, when actually it'd be very easy just to morph it into a more national award, rather than one that's bestowed in effect through the king or queen.
There's an awful lot of.
I bet your family didn't say that, Frank, when you got yours.
No, actually, I have to say,
I happen to have this here.
No, the thing is that I think I've spoken about this before, but and it's quite sort of relevant, I think, today, and my brother. But when a letter came about that, my immediate thought was, I'm not comfortable with this. But then it was this sense of my mother and father had died, and I know that my mother, particularly, who's born in Ireland in a little village in Palace Green, came over here as a 15-year-old chambermaid, would have been absolutely over the moon. This would, and my father would have thought it was amazing, and in a way it was because of that, and also the feeling that I think I was nominated by the cooperative group, and who I was still sort of connected with, and I'm thinking, well, how do I turn that round? I mean, and my family were really honoured, probably more than I was, to be honest, to attend, Buckingham Palace, to meet the King, get the award. But it still troubles me, because I listened to Alistair Campbell on his podcast, and on a number of occasions I'm running around the streets of Cheadle-Hulme listening to the podcast, and he's talking about, we really ought to get rid of these awards, and I sympathise with the argument he's putting forward, but still I've got this sort of like lump of lead over here, which is the family and all that sort of stuff, and I can't get rid of it. So it's really difficult, and it's, in a way, it's the and that's why I try and push for more of a national award, one that's not necessarily linked into the king or queen. But we are where we are with this at the moment. Right. What's caught my eye? Two things. we've had a minister reluctantly or being told at the weekend that they have to stand down. And I don't know if you managed to read the letter that the minister or former minister wrote, but there was very little contrition in it. It was as if, I mean, and I think that there is something here about how individuals lose confidence with the people that they're working with. And I find it quite remarkable that in politics, you can, in effect, have most of your party not behind you, but as long as you've got enough support in the cabinet or in the top table, you can survive for a very, very long time. Now, I don't think that's the case in education. I think we've said before, you've got to, when a senior leader stands up in front of their staff, you've got to have a feeling that the majority are with me here. It may even be a challenging position we've got to move to get to, but there's a sense of, I trust what you're about. I feel as though you're, I'll come with you on this. It's completely different in politics to what it is in education. And in some respects, I wish there was a little bit more of the education element within politics, because I think in education, you have to, as a leader, you have to open discussion, you have to open dialogue with people to get yourself to a position where you feel as though you can take the majority of your staff forward, and that does require a bit of give and take on both sides. And it feels as though the government's got themselves into a right pickle over, standing up and alongside people that probably they should really not be supporting. But also with regard to the strike action that we've had this week, there needs to be some little bit of movement on both sides to find a compromise. So I think it's just about that the way that minister was dismissed, the manner it was done, it probably reflects a lot of other things within the government where probably a little bit more movement around the place and getting to know what other people's views are and trying to give ground would be helpful.
Yeah, it's about, I mean, when you compare it to a school, making sure you've got enough people on side often changes your view when you're going through that process of negotiating, finding out what people think. And it's very easy for somebody to give you a really coherent argument to say, actually, you might not be right with where you're going. And I find then that influences me, and I'll step back a bit and think, am I really doing this? I had a chair of governors who was absolutely brilliant, let me say, but he used to come in and say, well, what do you want from this meeting? What would you like this decision to be? And I'd say what it was. And then once we were in a meeting with the governors, and the governors in conversation came up with a rational argument to do something different. And so I said, yeah, okay, I think you're right. Let's go with that. The next day, the chair of governors nearly knocked the door off my office as he barged in and said, you will never do that to me again. If I decide the outcome of that's what it's going to be. And I thought, wow, for somebody who's always been able to listen to various sides of an argument and hopefully steer everybody to a place where we can all agree, that was like, wow, I've never met that. And I have to say, he was a brilliant chair of governors, but part of it was because he'd come through committees. He was a local councillor. He knew how to manage committees. He knew how to manage meetings. And I was breaking the mold by changing my mind during the meeting.
Peter, I mean, you mentioned there about local councillors. I mean, I don't know, you didn't mention before that you've recently become a local councillor.
Yeah, so I won a by-election in November. So I've only got a 5-month gig before the full elections in May. But yeah, it was something I really I wanted to do for a very long time. Get inside and and get involved in that local side of politics. And it's been fascinating, really fascinating. It was a brilliant experience actually running in the election in the first place. And as I said to my wife on the day of the actual election, I said, well, listen, even if I don't get it, and I said, I think it'll be close. I said, even if I don't get it, it's been a brilliant, brilliant experience working with so many people, meeting so many different people. And then obviously I was lucky enough just about to get it. And
how close was it?
Oh, it was well, about 35 votes into it,
Oh
I think.
wow!
So
Right.
it was very, it was yeah, it was an opposition party ward, so it
Right.
was one
So
of their seats.
yeah.
So I always knew it was going to be close because I grew up in the ward, and ever since being a kid and aware of politics, it had always been one that had swung sort of both ways. And yeah, so I knew it was a close one, but it's been brilliant. Really enjoyed it. So this week's been a particularly busy week because we've had parents' evening on a Tuesday. There was a full council meeting last night where I got in a little reference to Athenian democracy, which I was quite happy about. And then there's another scrutiny meeting tonight. So it's been brilliant, though. I think the first time I was in the town hall, even though I grew up in the town, was when I actually went to start the role, and it's just fabulous, brilliant building.
Do you do
Inside.
in local politics? Do they do like when you're elected as an MP, you make your inaugural speech? Is it the same
Yeah.
in local politics?
No, I was really hoping that I would get to do a maiden speech, and I didn't. And I had so much material for it as well. I had, not to be a big geek, but I had big stacks of Cicero ready, and all sorts to deploy, and I never got a chance to use it. So no, unfortunately, I didn't get to deliver a maiden speech. I'd have loved to. But it's been a brilliant experience. It's really, really fabulous, and it's just it's great to see that side of the council that I wasn't aware of, all of the unelected people and how hard working they are and the challenges that they face. And it's been really nice to make a real difference to the actual community as well, and be able to sort things out for people. And it's been fabulous. It's been brilliant. I suspect it'll be very tight again, but
Oh, right.
it's been an experience.
Yeah.
Really enjoyed it.
So how often are people contacting you as their local councillor? How are you managing that?
Yeah, well, I think in the first week I had quite a bumper set of emails. I've got a suspicion that some were maybe set up to test out the new lad. But then since then, it's been sort of fairly regular. I've got a very understanding wife, which is helpful. So it's mainly evenings where I get through stuff. But so far, I mean, my two children are at the age where they're not young anymore. They're 15 and 10, so I've got a little bit more time to be able to do a bit of work every night. But it's been a brilliant experience. Really enjoyed it, and fingers crossed for May that I don't get the big boot.
Right. Well, we've reached near the end of the chat. At this stage, Peter, we normally ask our guest to just let us know of one thing they'd like to introduce or change in education that would improve the lives of the children and young people. I don't know. Have you had a chance to think about what that might be?
It's a tough one because it's tricky. Am I going and being stereotypical and making everyone learn ancient Greek or not? But I'm not going to do that. I'm torn between two things. One thing that I'm torn between is bringing modern foreign language learning a lot earlier in the system, because by the time that our students get to proper MFL lessons, they're in year 7, they're maybe a little bit closed off to it. And I really do think that if we introduced language learning in reception in year 1, I think that would be hugely beneficial. Some of the most exceptional students I've had the privilege to teach have been students their English is their third language. Polish or German is their first and second, and English is their third.
Yeah.
But equally, the thing I'm going to go with, and I think the easiest one to do, is a return to modular examination. I really passionately detest linear exams. I just think that the current system is a speed writing memory exercise with such a narrow definition of intelligence, and we're basically attacking our children right from an early age with year 6 SATs.
Year four tables assessment.
Oh, it's ridiculous.
Phonics.
Yeah, he's doing his year 6 SATs at the moment, and I consider myself a fairly literate person. I love my languages. I love my Latin, my Italian. I read all of the time, and I got stumped on fronted adverbials, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
And I had to ask Alexa what a fronted adverbial was, and I thought, this is madness. Why are they doing this? But I think just, life isn't linear, in terms of, life is a series of, modular. I sound a bit like Forrest Gump now, don't I? But life is a series of modular examinations and assessments, and the fact that they were making our students learn something for 2 or 3 years and then picking something out of a hat, and then saying, well, if you don't know that, you're a failure and you don't know your stuff. It's criminal.
I think that the
don't you think this has also driven all this cognitive load theory? I worry that people are looking at this now as a new golden bullet for education, but actually it's only necessary if you're just testing people on the memory. If that's the outcome, you test on the memory, then all the stuff on knowledge accumulation and remembering and all that is important. But if you just recognize that may be not the best way to test children, then all of that other stuff falls away.
This is quite a good way of finishing this chat, because if you remember, Stan, when we asked my brother what would he put in room 101, he said end of course work, end of course assessments, tests, and to go back to teach much heavily based teacher assessment approach, because he's old enough to know to reflect on what that was like, when that was the main way in which they assessed when he was the head of English in North Wales. But so it's quite topical, I think, for me. It's something I'm doing work with, rethinking assessment at the moment. We had Dr James Mannion on as a guest, and he's driving quite a lot of work with a number of other academics. Andy Hodgkinson, Dr Andy Hodgkinson's another one. And in a way, recently I was asked, can you give us 5 or 6, crazy things that children have to do in order to get their GCSEs or A-levels, or whatever. So it was very easy to come up with some crazy things that they're doing. But anyway, I'm just reflecting on my brother again. Okay, so thank you, Peter. It's been a great chat.
Thank you for having me.
I mean, I think, you can see why students, though, Peter, want to study your subject, because you make it so exciting and relevant. And actually, as somebody who's never taught, never been taught Latin in my life, it makes me feel as I want to go back and have a look at those books.
I'm just thinking I might go and dig out, because I did buy it, Stephen Fry's book on the
mythos. Yeah, it's brilliant.
So it's upstairs, brand spanking new, never opened, even though I was certain I was going to read it.
Right, well, next week we have Professor Mel Ainscough as our guest. Mel is a real strong sort of advocate for collaboration and cooperation, and also undertakes a lot of research in various European and South American countries as well. So it'll be really interesting. Bit of a change from the Latin, I suspect, but nonetheless, it's going to be an interesting chat. So thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. And thank you, Peter, for being our guest this week.
Peter, that was really good.
Yeah.
Thank you.